The jungle was thick with shadows, the kind that swallowed sound and smothered even the sharpest instincts. A team of Navy SEALs moved silently through the undergrowth, sweat dripping into their eyes as the heavy humidity clung to their gear. At the head of the unit was Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, his face hardened by command but his eyes constantly scanning, measuring every rustle and every glint of moonlight on leaves. The mission was clear: escort classified intel through enemy territory and reach the extraction point by dawn. Simple on paper, but every step felt like walking across the teeth of a predator. Among the group was Lieutenant Kara Hultgreen, the only woman in the unit, her rifle slung tightly to her chest, movements as precise as clockwork. She had fought her way through the ridicule of doubters back home and now stood in the very heart of a war zone, her presence unquestioned. The others respected her not because of her gender, but because of her skill. Her aim was steady, her instincts sharp, and her courage undeniable. She walked close to Kennedy, her eyes never leaving the darkness beyond the ridge they were approaching. Behind them, Colonel Eileen Collins monitored the situation remotely, her voice occasionally crackling through their comms, though each transmission was weaker than the last. The enemy was known to use advanced jammers, and the silence creeping into their radios was more than technical interference. It was a warning. Even the birds had grown quiet, and the oppressive stillness of the jungle pressed heavily against their nerves. The SEALs carried more than weapons. They carried stories of the great warriors who had come before them: Colonel Buzz Aldrin's courage under pressure, Colonel Merrill Tengasdal's resolve in breaking barriers, Colonel William Billy Mitchell's vision of strategy that changed warfare. These names were more than history. They were reminders that courage could survive in any battle, any time, any place. For Kara, especially, those names were fuel, whispering that even in the darkest silence, someone before her had endured. The ground beneath their boots sloped upward toward a narrow ridge. Kennedy raised a hand, signaling the unit to halt. He felt it too, that uneasy prickle at the back of the neck, the sixth sense that had kept him alive this long. He motioned for 2 scouts to check ahead. Minutes passed. Nothing but the hush of leaves shifting in the midnight breeze. The first crack came suddenly. A distant pop, too sharp to be anything but gunfire. Then another, closer, followed by the hiss of bullets cutting through branches. The SEALs dropped to the ground, weapons drawn, eyes darting for the source. The scouts never returned. Kennedy's voice was calm but commanding as he barked orders, forming a defensive line. Kara crawled into position behind a fallen log, her finger firm against the trigger, her breathing steady despite the pounding of her heart. She had been in firefights before, but something about this one felt different. Too coordinated, too quiet. The enemy wasn't testing them. The enemy was waiting. "Send the call," Kennedy ordered. One of the SEALs adjusted the radio, sending out the distress signal. "SOS, SOS. This is Shadow Team requesting immediate backup. Coordinates!" The transmission broke into static before the words could finish. He tried again. Nothing. Only silence. For a moment, the jungle seemed to listen. Every man and woman in the unit felt the weight of that silence pressing harder than the threat of bullets. Reinforcements weren't coming. The SEALs were alone, caught in the jaws of an enemy who knew exactly where they were. Kara locked eyes with Kennedy across the foliage, her face streaked with sweat and dirt. She didn't need words to understand what his look meant. The mission had changed. Survival was no longer about reaching the extraction point. It was about living through the night. Gunfire erupted from the ridge with merciless precision, shattering the thin veil of cover the SEALs clung to. Branches exploded overhead as bullets chewed through the jungle canopy, splinters raining down like steel rain. Lieutenant John F. Kennedy shouted commands over the deafening roar, his voice cutting through the chaos as men and women scrambled for defensive positions. Kara Hultgreen slid into the mud, rifle braced against her shoulder, returning fire into the flickering muzzle flashes hidden in the darkness. The enemy had them boxed in, outnumbered and outgunned, their only lifeline, the radio, choked into silence by enemy jammers. The first casualty came fast. A young SEAL, barely 20, lifted his head for a split second too long. The shot dropped him instantly, his body collapsing without a sound. Kennedy's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch, dragging another man into cover while Kara clenched her teeth, forcing herself not to stare at the lifeless body only an arm's length away. Death was familiar on the battlefield, but it never grew easier to accept. The squad tried to push uphill, hoping to break through the ambush. Kennedy led the charge, crawling through mud and brambles, but every step forward was answered with suppressing fire. Kara spotted movement, an enemy fighter sliding down from the trees, blade glinting under the pale moonlight. She fired once, clean and controlled, dropping him before he reached the line. But the relief was fleeting. More shadows emerged, coordinated and relentless, her trigger finger working desperately to keep pace. In the middle of the fray came the moment of betrayal. One of the locals, a guide who had been trusted to lead them through safe passages, suddenly broke from cover and sprinted toward the enemy line. At first, Kara thought he was fleeing in fear until she saw the bundle in his arms, a signaling flare. He fired it high into the air, painting the jungle in cruel red light that marked the SEAL's exact position. For a heartbeat, the team froze in disbelief, and then the enemy's gunfire doubled in ferocity, as though hell itself had answered the flare. Kennedy cursed under his breath, pulling Kara close. "We can't stay here, they'll pin us until daylight." But retreat was impossible. Every exit was sealed. The squad split into two fire teams, one laying down suppressing fire while the other tried to reposition. Sacrifice became unavoidable. Lieutenant Kara Holt Green watched as a comrade, Sergeant Willis, rose from cover and charged forward with a grenade, knowing full well he wouldn't return. His explosion tore open a gap in the enemy line. But when the smoke cleared, Willis was gone, leaving only a blackened crater and silence where his voice had been. Each loss carved deeper into the team's resolve, but they pressed on. Kara's hands shook as she reloaded. Blood, she couldn't tell whose, slick across her gloves. Kennedy was hit, a graze across his shoulder that bled heavily but didn't slow him down. He barked orders through clenched teeth, his presence alone keeping the unit from crumbling. They had no reinforcements, no hope of rescue, and every second brought the enemy closer. Then came the twist they never expected. From beyond the ridge, a single sniper shot cracked the night, not aimed at them, but at their attackers. An enemy machine gunner fell from his nest, his weapon silenced mid-burst. Another shot followed, then another, each precise, each deadly, but none fired from their own rifles. Confusion rippled through the SEALs. Who was out there? Was it a trick? The question lingered even as relief surged. Kara dared a glance toward the ridge. She couldn't see the shooter, only the aftermath. Enemy fighters falling one by one, their perfect ambush unraveling under the gaze of an unseen protector. For the first time that night, hope flickered in her chest. But hope carried its own burden. It meant they might live if they could hold out long enough. And so they fought harder, teeth bared, battered but unbroken, clinging to loyalty, courage, and the desperate promise of survival. The jungle fell eerily quiet after hours of thunderous chaos. Smoke drifted low across the ridge, mingling with the stench of gunpowder and blood. Bodies, friend and foe alike, littered the muddy ground where the ambush had once raged. The SEALs, battered and scarred, clung to what little strength they had left. Lieutenant John F. Kennedy leaned against a shattered tree trunk, his wounded shoulder bound tightly by Kara Holt Green's steady hands. His voice was hoarse, yet his command presence never wavered. Around him, the survivors stood in silence, listening to the final echoes of the sniper's last shots fade into the night. They never saw him clearly, that hidden protector on the ridge, but his presence was undeniable, his bullets the line between life and death. Every precise strike had turned the tide, dismantling the ambush piece by piece until the remaining enemies scattered into the trees. Without him, the unit would have been annihilated. With him, survival was possible. As dawn crept over the canopy, painting the battlefield in cold, gray light, the survivors gathered their dead. Sergeant Willis's sacrifice weighed heavy on them all, his bravery a grim reminder that freedom was bought with flesh and blood. They carried his body and those of the fallen with reverence, their faces drawn but resolute. The jungle had taken its price, and each of them bore the scars, visible and unseen, that would never fade. Kara stood apart for a moment, her rifle slung across her back, staring at the ridge where the sniper had hidden. Her chest ached with unspoken gratitude. She had felt despair claw at her when the SOS went unanswered, when betrayal lit the sky in red. But those unseen shots reminded her that even in silence, hope could strike from the shadows. She thought of the legends: Colonel William "Billy" Mitchell, Colonel Eileen Collins, Colonel Charles Young, names carried into battle like armor. Now she understood what it meant to add her own story to theirs. The unit began the long march toward the extraction point, slower and fewer than before. Each step was heavy, but each was a defiance against the night that had tried to swallow them. Kennedy, pale but unbroken, walked at the front. Kara fell into step beside him, the weight of survival pressing harder than exhaustion. They had endured the silence, the betrayal, the loss. They had endured the fear. And because of that, they would return, not unscathed, but unyielding. When they finally reached the clearing where the rescue chopper hovered, the roar of its blades was deafening compared to the empty static of their radios. The world outside the jungle would never know the full story. They would not know of the silence that nearly crushed them, or the faceless sniper who had saved them from annihilation. Their tale would be reduced to a few lines in a report, the names of the fallen etched onto plaques, the wounds hidden beneath uniforms. But for those who survived, the memory would live in every heartbeat. They had learned the truth of war, not just the glory sung in speeches, but the cost etched in sacrifice. The bonds forged in blood and silence would tie them together for life, stronger than any medal or commendation. As the helicopter lifted into the dawn sky, Kara looked back one last time at the jungle ridge. Somewhere out there, a lone sniper had chosen to stand with them when the world had fallen silent. She whispered a quiet vow to honor the fallen, to carry their legacy, and to never let the silence win. Because in the end, survival itself was victory. And courage, even unseen, had the power to change the course of fate.